So, this well-known psychology study that said that before lunch, our willpower, decision-making, and attention goes dramatically down. So I deeply apologize for this side effect. So altruism, yes. So basically I want to share with you the idea that it's not just a noble, a bit naive utopia that we can afford when everything goes well, but otherwise it's definitely not pragmatic and usable, but rather that it is the only concept that can address the challenges of our times. So I'll try to make the case for that. So first of all, yes. So just what I see at breakfast from my hermitage, so you can imagine why I long to go there as quickly as possible. And so we need to understand why interdependence and understanding that common humanity, common sentience with 8 million other species need to lead to increased consideration for others. So how does it work? So what is altruism? Altruism is an intention to bring happiness to others and the cause of happiness. So it may be able to translate into action, but if for some reason you can't, still it's an altruistic motivation. Now it happens that people suffer a lot. So that altruistic wish transform itself as may suffering and the causes of suffering be alleviated. So it's basically a specific application of benevolence and altruism when it's confronted with suffering. Now wisdom is knowing reality as it is, because without wisdom, compassion can be blind. Without action, compassion is sterile, but we need discernment and wisdom and knowledge in order that it's not a foolish compassion, but it goes to the other side of effective altruism. Now, we also need to go from personal change to societal change. We cannot just change institutions. Every individual has to make some kind of personal change, but within the interdependence that when those individuals achieve a critical mass, then we are going to change the culture, we are going to change the institution, and the next generation will benefit from this change of culture. So that's a real need. So for that, we cannot work just based on self-centeredness. Of course, we want to be happy, we want to be alive, we want to fulfill our aspiration, but not at the cost of others' suffering or ignoring others. And just the me first is not going to work, because that excessive self-cherishing leads to very enhanced and exacerbated attraction and repulsion. That itself leads to hatred, desire, attachment, lack of discernment, jealousy, in the end, suffering. So altruism and compassion is a win-win situation. So on the personal level, we all know, and that has been shown by positive psychology, that love is the supreme emotion. And if you look in the brain, when meditators engage in compassion meditation, loving kindness meditation, that is the type of meditation that activates areas of the brain in the strongest possible way of anything you can do voluntarily to activate areas of your brain. Much more than attention, much more than anything else. And a vast network, not only about altruism, but also related to well-being, related to sense of belonging, related to empathy. So in a way, it's the kind of mental state that is the most fulfilling, as well as it is intended to benefit others. So there's a win-win situation. While selfishness is a lose-lose situation. The me first all day long in this bubble of selfishness makes you miserable because you are so vulnerable, so concerned only with you. The whole world becomes either an enemy or a potential instrument to maximizing your preferences, and you become a pain to everybody else around. So it's really a lose-lose situation. So now, why it is the most pragmatic answers to the challenge of our time? Because there's a schizophrenic dialogue when you see, let's assume that most of the time, most of 7 billion beings would rather like to behave decently with each other and have a better world. But you put some investors together with politicians, social workers, policymakers, and scientists of the environment, And it's a schizophrenic dialogue. Investors speak of 4 or 5 years. You don't issue bonds, treasury bond that mature in 100 years. Who will be interested? So the short term of the economy, or just surviving day to day to feed your kids. This is the immediate needs. Then there's a longer term. How do you have a fulfilled life? How you can prosper in life? Because a nation that will be most powerful and the richest and everyone is miserable, what's the point? So that's a 20 years, that's a lifetime, that's a career, a generation. And then we have this new challenge, the long term, which was not there before. 12,000 years ago, we were 5 million people on Earth. No big deal, whatever we could do very little harm and very little good. And we had tools that we held in our hands. That much you can do. Now we have this incredible increase of power to all what we have now with the scientific, industrial, and revolution. And this power, which is millionfold bigger, is in the hands of groups and nations. And so if we don't match that with the same amount of care and consideration, then we are in trouble. So now, if you say that selfishness is going to solve the job, well, my favorite Marxist is Groucho Marx. He said, why should I care for a future generation? What did they do for me? The problem is that many people are saying that seriously today. And you guess who? So now, that will not work. That will not solve social injustice, nothing of those. So more consideration for others will have a caring economics. It will be at the service of society rather than the opposite. If we are more consideration for others, we'll remedy to social injustice, poverty in the midst of plenty, the problem of the commons, and so forth. And if we are more consideration for others, we will obviously care for the fate of future generations. Otherwise, they will come and say, you knew and you did nothing. They're not going to praise us in a few generations' time. That's the ultimate challenge, because we won't be there. We won't get the blame. It's our grandchildren is sort of abstract, but they will be there for sure, and they will not want to suffer. That natural right that they have. So in a way, if selfishness doesn't do the job, consideration for others does the job, because then you can sit at the same table with economists, investors, policymakers, and scientists and try to build up together a better future on this idea of having more consideration for others in the short, mid, and long term. And that works, and that's pragmatic. So now it starts with ourselves, from personal to societal change. Our mind can be our best friend. This is one of my teachers that I met 50 years ago in Darjeeling, in India. But our mind, and we know, also can be our worst enemy. The increase of mental health issues is not the single most biggest factor, according to WHO, for numbers of days we are disabled in life and not being able to function, 40%. Because cancer and heart disease, you survive or you die, but you are not impaired from years to go. So that is a huge problem. It starts with ourselves. So we need to deal better with our mind, have more emotional balance to gain more inner strength, inner freedom, wisdom, compassion, all these things that makes us to flourish. We need to remedy to the poverty in the midst of plenty. The Homo economicus cannot do that. You don't maximize your personal preferences by taking people out of poverty. It's not your and also you are not able to deal with abusing other species if they favor your immediate interest, and that's a huge thing now. I recently evaluated that the number of Homo sapiens that have ever been on Earth is about 100 billion, because we were not so many long time ago. That's the number of animals that we kill every 2 months, 100 billion, for so-called needs, and we don't need that actually. So there's a vast also moral gap in terms of treating other species. So now we are also exhausting our only planet as if it had unlimited resources. And everybody knows that we would need 3 planets by 2050 if we go on the same way. So it's not a sustainable development. It's not even sustainable harmony. It's just not viable. So how can we do? We are at the edge of a precipice. And someone said, I won't quote who, he said 5 years ago we were at the edge of the precipice. Now we made a big step forward. So more of the same will not do the job. And scientists, like my friend Johan Rockström, have devised what they call planetary boundaries. And if we remain with those factors of safety, we can continue in the Holocene to prosper for 50,000 years by remaining in equilibrium with our planet and continue to prosper as a civilization. So in 1900, we were well within, although not everything was measured, but we can guess what it was. In 1950 comes the great acceleration, where things start to loom a little bit more dangerous. And today we vastly went about the limits, especially biodiversity. We are running to the 6th major extinction of species since we were on Earth. The last one goes back millions of years ago for the dinosaurs. And by 2050, we'll lose 30% of biodiversity. That's going to affect hugely not only those rare animals, but everyone on Earth. So we need to do something about that. And so why? Is it because we are so damn selfish? Sigmund Freud said, I've discovered very little good in humans. From what I know, most of them are rascals. So it's a bad start in life, I would say. But also it's not true. We know that there's an innate goodness. We know that children prefer to cooperate than others. They prefer to give to other kids than to receive. There's a lot of study, like Paul Bloom and others have done that at Yale. So there is this kind of love of cooperation, of the quality of human relationship. That's something that we appreciate more than anything else. And not only in humans. This joy of cooperation, that's throughout cultures, everywhere. There's so much joy in working together, celebrating, doing things together. And that's not restricted to human beings by no means. Now there's a struggle for life, the survival of the fittest, social Darwinism, and it's not always the one who wins. But if you look at recent works in evolution, yes, of course, there is competition, but cooperation has been much more creative throughout evolution to go to increased levels of complexity and to reach to what we are, social animals. If you look at Super Cooperators by Martin Nowak of Harvard, cooperation is much more productive than just sheer competition. And also you can struggle for life together instead of against each other. And there's also this fact that we have that within ourselves. And even animals do that. There's a choice to make there. Now, people use a lot the word empathy, and I want to say a few things about that because this is a huge issue now in the medical work, in social workers. Empathy is a very important quality that we have to recognize the situation of others. You can have cognitive empathy. I sit next to someone with panic in an aeroplane. I love that, but I don't feel it, but I know she's in problem or he's in trouble, and I can do something. That's cognitive empathy. Now, affective empathy, if someone is actually suffering, then I suffer because of the suffering of the others. So if I do that day after day, patients come and go, but I stay there, and day after day, all day long, I suffer because of others' suffering. As you can imagine, that's too much. So either people say you should distance yourself, which is not very good, you become cold, or you burn out and you change your job. And it affects 60% of all medical personnel in the US, and I found recently 80% in Singapore. I was speaking at the university there, and they came with the study. So there's a huge problem among social workers and others. Because standalone empathy, the effect that suffering of others has on you, leads to empathic distress and burnout. So I studied that with a neuroscientist called Tanya Singer, and she put me in the scanner for a number of hours. And we found that it's a complete different network, and that altruistic love and compassion is actually a remedy to burnout. If you look at the empathy, and empathy leads, standalone empathy leads to kind of distress, it's self-centered, and the more you do it, the more your resources, inner resources, dwindle, and then you get discouraged and overwhelmed. While compassion and altruistic love is a constructive, positive, regenerating feeling, and we found it works and acts as the antidote to the burnout. So now she started a project called Resource Program. It is meant to train medical workers, social workers, to build up this capacity for loving kindness, compassion, human warmth, so that they don't burn out when facing suffering. Now, this is also has been spearheaded by the many scientists working with the Dalai Lama, who is always interested in science. So Richard Davidson, she's one of the leading neuroscientists on emotion. Myself, I was studying with great masters, and the idea came to collaborate, to bring the monks to the lab. And myself, I spent 120 hours at the fMRI machine. I'm sort of flying guinea pig. I know all the fMRIs all over the place, how narrow they are, and all these things. So the idea was to study the effect of short, mid, and long-term mind training on the brain, on the immune system, to see if meditation is just, going to a spa with a nice incense smoke and relaxing and then starting all over again, or does it make real change? So the beginning, they started with people who had done 50,000 hours of meditation. That's a lot. A violinist who does his first concert is about 10,000 hours to get consummate skill. This is 50,000 hours. So now the idea was, if we don't find anything in those guys, then forget about those who did 2 weeks of mindfulness meditation. But so we brought a lot of those of good meditators and less good meditators. This is the first time I went for 2.5 hours non-stop in fMRI. So Richard Davidson is very relieved that I survived the ordeal. Immediately we found that there was a huge difference between trained people and untrained people. Down there you see the electroencephalogram of a control group of volunteers, asking them to meditate on compassion, that's the blue line, and then to remain in a neutral state, that's the pink line, and there's no difference. So although they feel something, no difference. If you take long-term meditators, this is the resting line here, and then the peak is when they engage in compassion meditation. There's a 1,000-fold increase in some areas of the brain connected with positive emotion and other things. So clearly there was a big effect of training. And then if you look at the brain imagery, here the novices, whether they meditate at rest or no difference. Of course, they are not trained, no mystery. The long-term practitioner at rest, there's no activation. When they engage in compassion meditation, there's a lot of activities in area connected with belonging, with empathy, with parental love, with positive emotions, and so forth. So now the point is, good for you, in the Himalayas, but what about us, So the good news is, yes, you can work 4 weeks, 20 minutes a day also makes a difference, not only in behavior, but even in the structure of the brain. You can already see a structural change compared to a control group within 4 weeks. That's not too much asking, no? So that's very encouraging. That means you don't have to wait 50,000 hours. Not only that, but 2 weeks of compassion training, 20 minutes a day, not only change the brain, but match with the pro-social behavior increase. So you see how this personal change can then lead to, of course, a more pro-social society, a more pro-social schooling, a more pro-social medical world, business world, whatever, and what more that we need to be more pro-social in our days. So the good news is also it's faster than genes, because to have an altruistic gene will take 50,000 years if it's selected for, which is too long. We don't have time for that. But cultures are a Darwinian process, and they change much faster. Like our attitude towards war. We don't think anymore that's the melting pot of civilization, all those crap that we were told earlier. Now everybody's against it. Now we changed our attitude towards the environment, which we're starting to change to attitude, of course, towards women, towards any categories of human beings that were mistreated. And we do change in a big way, and that goes faster than genes. And that can be selected. Maybe a more cooperative trait as a cultural trait can be selected to achieve our own survival. So we need not sustainable growth, because growth is always about quantitative growth, and we cannot go on endlessly, but to better quality with less quantity, so a sustainable harmony. And that's in the short term, sustainable harmony is to reduce inequality and more social justice. And in the long term is to remain in harmony with our environment, without that now at about half of the year, in July or August, we already exhausted what the Earth can remunerate for this year. So we are clearly in a complete disequilibrium. So that's the only way to go about nature. We also need to understand that the Holocene, that very stable period of climate that we have for the last 12,000 years that now being jeopardized, is our Eden. If we could maintain that, we can continue to thrive as we did and allow human civilization to thrive. We need the caring economics. That means the economy is balanced between financial wealth, societal wealth, and environmental wealth. Now, everybody has been laughing at Bhutan for doing the gross national happiness, but actually that's what they measure. You spoke about GDP. They consider that someone who smokes is good for GDP. Then the person goes to hospital with lung cancer, is good for GDP. Then he dies, then there's expenses for the funeral, that's good for GDP. While Bhutan is counting that as a negative social wealth, and they do that in their annual budget. They count sort of volunteer work as a social wealth plus. They evaluated that the value of the forest not cut are 10 times the GDP. So they put in the constitution that there cannot be less than 65% of natural coverage in the country. In the constitution, that's not quite pretty good. So it's not a matter just of laughing at them because it's a small country, but the model of having those three indicators is certainly better than having just one, basically, and everything at the service of the GDP. And now European Union wanted to include drug trafficking and prostitution in the GDP. What good does it do to society? So now, can money buy happiness? And we know all the Easterlin paradox. Yes, if you are very poor, if you are below the poverty line, not much after that. So everything else, you know what to do. At the Founders Pledge, please use it. And there's a good study for that. Is money doesn't buy happiness unless given to others. What a better news than that. That was studied in 27 countries. And Elizabeth Dunn studied people who give a little bit or a lot, but they do give compared to a control group of similar background and everything else that never does. And she found that they are 20 to 30% happier. So there's a good news. You know what to do. So we need local commitment and global responsibility. We are back to the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's so much that we can do there. And extend altruism to the 8 other million species. That is at the least we can do. So there's a lot of things we can do. Sometimes we are not as good as they. It happens. Now, we need to find happiness through altruism and compassion. That's really if you want one top secret about happiness is to be altruistic and compassionate. That will take care. You know what you said about promote humanity and the rest will take care of itself. Now there are a few interesting food for thought. You know, the Age of Empathy of France de Waal. This is the best study about altruism in human. It's a wonderful academic and super cooperators I mentioned. And those are the books that you don't have to read by this little monk. This is about neuroscience. And this I worked 5 years at the altruism post-traumatic syndrome because I worked tirelessly for 5 years to bring 1,600 scientific reference to make the case for altruism, that altruism does exist, that is pragmatic, that we can put it to use in economy, in education, of cooperative learning, and so forth. Now, all that is nice, but if we don't walk the talk, what's the point, isn't it? So I have 7 minutes to try to say. We need compassion in action, otherwise it's all blah, 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 you know. Hot air, contributing to global warming with more talk and not action. So I started an organization about 20 years ago. I wanted to call it Compassion in Action. In France, they said, no, this is too religious. So I called Karuna, which means the same, but nobody knew at that time. So I had no means. I was living in this nice hermitage with about $50 a month. Suddenly I did a book with my father, the French philosopher Jean-François Revel, who became a bestseller. So I said, I don't need a Ferrari. In the Himalaya, you can't put swimming pool because there's too much slope. So let's use it for others. So we started this organization, and some of my friends here are working with us. And gradually, with a group of friends, and just growing organically, and I think that's one of the secrets, doing better and more of the same and knowing to be very grassroots, we managed to be a medium-sized organization that, as you said, helps 300,000 people in India, in very impoverished state of Bihar and Jharkhand, in Nepal and Eastern Tibet. So our idea was small money, big change. Let's try to do the maximum impact that we can do. So in the field of health and education. And so for instance, we'll give you an example. Bamboo school. Speak of return on investment. For $100,000, you can build in 3 months a school for 2,000 kids. That's pretty neat. And then about education, you mentioned, we have a very neat system of finding teachers. We put an advertisement, say we need 300 teachers. We get 1,000 applications. So we select 300, and then we run each teacher for 2 weeks in the school, and then the kids choose. Try to do that in France, we'll get in trouble. Why? Because then the teacher is so much, they feel they can relate with the teacher. They're very engaged with the teacher. So that's I think, a good way to go. So you see the happiness of the kids to learn. In Eastern Tibet, there was in the nomadic areas, there's absolutely zero school. So we start from scratch. And you can't believe the enthusiasm of those kids. They come while the school is being built, and they will go around. This is our school. And then when you ask them 2-3 years later, what job will you want to do when you become big? Half of them say, I want to be a teacher, because they got so much benefit from the teacher, and they saw so much how education enlightened their mind in a way. So instead of Bihar and Jharkhand in India, we do women literacy. You cannot believe the joy of those 50-year-old women learning how to read and write. They say, now I can open a bank account. And you don't have to, of course you should evaluate, but the best evaluation is they all run to those, the 2 hours that we give every 2 days of this literacy school for the women. All the women of the village come, and then the next village they come and say, what about us? So it's spread like that. So in a way, the evaluation is by the enthusiasm that the people themselves put in the program. We found out that in the areas in India where we were, they do a lot of monoculture. That means the farmer now, they were going to the market to buy the food for their family, because they only either wheat or rice, and they don't have vegetable and fruits. That's really crazy for farmers. So we started the kitchen garden. So we have a nursery of plants, 30 different kinds of seedlings of different kinds of foods, and we give them that, and we dedicate a small plot. We started with 100 of these, and then we saw that they start exchanging vegetables, and then they don't have to go to the market. So now we have 10,000, and then we got the critical mass of number of gardens, so that we don't need to do it anymore, because they all copy each other, they all do it, and we still come to the nursery to get the seedling, but we don't have to convince them. So the fact that they respond so enthusiastically to those initiatives, I think show that for them, there's obvious benefit from that. And this, the photo of Steve McCurry, of the little Afghan girl. So this is our Karuna girl. I saw her in a kitchen near one of our clinics in Tibet some 15 years ago. And then 2 years ago, I found her again. So she's called Beautiful Ocean of Turquoise. And that's a kind of symbol of what we're trying to do the most good we can do with the means that we have, and with the pure hearts and dirty hands, and putting everything we have at the service of others. And in my case, my pledge is I give 100% of everything from my books, from conference, everything, so I don't have to calculate. It's very simple calculation. Thank you so much.